Hello, this is Business Live from BBC News with Alice Baxter and Ben Thompson.
The tech giants unveil their earnings and it's tough times for Microsoft, but Amazon and Google continue to dominate.
Live from London, it's our top story today, Friday, the 23rd of October. Amazon reports a surprise profit while Google's Alphabet sees profits soar by 50%. We'll have the details. Also today, a significant and sustained cyber attack on UK telecoms giant TalkTalk. Banking details and personal information of 4 million customers could be at risk. And after some upbeat corporate earnings and some warm words from central bankers yesterday, markets are moving after what's been a pretty boring few days for investors.
But the good news is that it's Friday, so that means we'll get the inside track on what we've learnt this week in the business world, thanks to our economics correspondent, Andrew Walker, who'll be with us a little bit later in the programme. Plus, we want to know, how generous is your boss? Because the chief executive of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, says that he's going to give a third of his shares in the company to his staff. Good move? Or what's the most generous thing that your boss has ever done for you? Let us know. Just use the hashtag BBC BizLive.
Yeah, we'll not discuss the generosity of BBC bosses. That's for another time. But nonetheless, welcome to the programme. Earnings season is well underway for the big tech firms, and there have been some surprises and some disappointments, notably from Microsoft. The strong dollar was to blame for the hit to Microsoft sales. It reported a fall of 6.6% in revenues for the third quarter. But over at the world's biggest online retailer, Amazon, sales there, they jumped largely thanks to its North American business. There, it reported a $79 million profit for the quarter. And the advertising giant Google reported a 45% surge in earnings. They came in at nearly $4 billion. Alice.
Thanks, Ben. Well, Richard Edwards is a principal research analyst at Ovum, and he joins me live now from Sheffield. Richard, many thanks for joining us here on the programme. So some mixed news from the tech companies, but all three beat expectations, didn't they?
Well, I think Microsoft disappointed a few, but it's going through this serious transition at the moment of its business. The old days of selling Windows and software on your PC are being changed by the cloud, which those other two businesses that you mentioned are making significant revenues off as well.
Yeah, a lot resting on which of these three tech giants has best mastered cloud technology, hasn't it? Internet marketplace Amazon, that's reporting that huge surprise profit of $79 million. What really drove that?
Well, I think what we're seeing with Amazon is it's this relentless sort of investment in sort of research and development relative to its revenues. Its profits are very skinny. You know, that's its sort of baseline way of beating the competition. But Bezos, you know, the company's chief exec, has sort of driven that company super hard in terms of making the most of every bit of new technology that's available to that organisation.
Just going back to Microsoft now, it has been going through some pretty major cost-cutting exercises, hasn't it? Really streamlining its operations. Do you think that's borne any fruit?
Well, certainly Microsoft now is seeing huge growth in its Office 365 business, both in business and also in consumer. So the average guy on the street is now sort of spending some money with Microsoft. So it's now sort of drawn a line under its past. It's had a change of leadership, of course, a couple of years ago, and now we're starting to see the new Microsoft emerge from this chrysalis.
Despite these strong results, actually, all three tech companies citing the strong dollar at the moment as being a hindrance to their business operations. But Alphabet, the new parent company of Google, that also reporting that a huge rise in profits, up almost 50% for the third quarter. Was that a surprise to you?
Well, I think there were lots of doubts as to whether or not Google could continue its revenue growth through advertising with the advent of small screen mobile devices. But it said it would find ways in which to continue building that business, and it's managed to do that, again through sort of making good use of its R&D budgets.
Yeah, OK, sadly we're going to have to leave it there. But Richard, many thanks. Richard Edwards there from Ovum. Good to get your analysis.
Let's bring you up to date with some of the other business headlines today, because United Airlines has reported a record quarterly profit that was driven by low oil prices and a tax windfall. The Chicago-based firm reported net income of $4.82 billion, which included more than $3.2 billion in tax benefits. The low price of fuel helped the company save nearly $1.2 billion.
Shares in Cable and Wireless soared 21% after confirming it's in takeover talks with Virgin Media owner Liberty Global, which also has a 10% stake in the UK television company ITV. It's not formally announced its offer, though.
The Swedish mobile telecoms equipment maker Ericsson says sales in China fell sharply, but sales in North America, they stayed pretty steady. It posted disappointing revenue and profits that came in below market expectations. Ericsson is the world's top mobile gear maker, but sales were down 9% in the third quarter.
Volkswagen says that it's looking into yet more of its diesel engines to see whether they also contain software used to manipulate emissions test data. The car maker said last month that banned software could be fitted in around 11 million vehicles worldwide. The German transport minister is to go to the US to hold talks on the scandal with its counterpart on Monday.
Yeah, that scandal just runs and runs, doesn't it? Let's just take you quickly to the BBC Business Live page, because we touched on it at the top of the show, but clearly more details emerging with that TalkTalk hacking, that cyber attack. Details on the live page if you need them. A sustained and serious hacking attack. The chief executive of TalkTalk has been talking to the BBC this morning, and they say they still can't be certain about the implications of what data has been accessed.
Yeah, over 4 million people in the UK affected by that. If we've got time to tell you about another story, this one caught our eye as well, about whether HSBC is going to indeed move its headquarters away from the UK. That was being mooted earlier in the year. Back then, the chat was all about it moving potentially to Hong Kong, where, of course, it's got over 100 years of history of operating. But now the suggestion is in the Financial Times that they might actually be considering the United States. So interesting movements there, but is it just saber-rattling? That's something that one analyst mooted to me earlier in the day.
Yeah, and that's been long discussed about whether they are just purely threatening to do that to get away from things like the bank levy and not necessarily to do with the way they want to run their business. But speaking of Asia, let's take you to the region now, and we're going to talk about South Korea's economic growth, because it accelerated at its fastest rate in more than 5 years. Sarah Toms is watching that story for us in our Asia Business Hub in Singapore. Sarah, just bring us up to date. So some significant growth figures coming out of there.
That's right, Ben. Yes, some good news from Asia for a change, actually. South Korea's economy grew 2.6% in the third quarter this year compared to last year. And as you said, that's a 5-year high, and it well exceeds estimates. It's the second quarter in a row of good performance. Analysts say the economy had been held back earlier in the year by the deadly MERS virus outbreak, which actually killed 36 people. Now, at the time of the outbreak, the quarantine, the restrictions on daily life affected tourism and, of course, domestic spending. Now, there were also worries that South Korea's export sector would be a drag on the economy, with companies like Hyundai doing badly. But as these figures now show, despite the concerns about China's slowdown, investors should actually be encouraged by these latest numbers out of South Korea.
Sarah, good to see you. Thanks so much. Have a great weekend there over in Singapore. I just want to bring you up to date with the numbers and what's moving them, because, as we said, lots of central bank talk yesterday really helped to break a pretty boring few days for market news. Tokyo stocks, so you can see across the board, the Nikkei ending up more than 2.1%. That rally sparked by those upbeat comments yesterday from the European Central Bank. Some stronger US corporate earnings too. You can see that left the Dow up just shy of 2% higher. Now, European stocks looking much stronger after the European Central Bank President Mario Draghi offered another possible interest rate cut or more QE, quantitative easing, at the next meeting of the central bank. That'll take place in December. There's also some evidence too that the Bank of England could now be the first to raise rates after UK retail sales rose pretty strongly, 6.5%. We got those figures yesterday, that's year on year. So the big question, who will be the first to fire the starting gun for a rate hike? Will it be the United States or the UK? Well, Bank of England Governor Mark Carney might wait for the Federal Reserve to go first. Who'll blink first? because a stronger pound, of course, would help lower inflation, but that's not necessarily a good thing. Analysts think the UK, though, has the stronger economy right now, so that will really weigh on that. What should we watch, though, on Wall Street today? Neda is in New York. She's got the details.
After the tech fest of Thursday, earnings season moves on to some of the big players in consumer goods and aviation. Procter & Gamble's earnings for the past quarter are now widely expected to show a disappointing revenue number. P&G is in the middle of a turnaround plan where it's aiming to cut the number of its brands to focus on fewer, more profitable lines. The consumer goods giant is also struggling with the impact of a strong U.S. dollar. 2/3 of its revenue usually comes from outside the U.S. Airlines are another business fighting the effects of the strong dollar. American Airlines will probably show as much when it reports third quarter earnings. Its great rival Delta has already announced it's cutting back on plans for expansion next year. Will American do the same?
Neda Torfit there for us. Well, joining us here in the studio is Richard Jeffrey, Chief Investment Officer at Cazenove Capital Management. Many thanks for joining us here in the studio. Richard, just want to begin with the point that Ben was raising earlier about what came out of the ECB on Thursday. Mario Draghi making the hint that come December 3rd, when the next meeting takes place, we might see this expansion of quantitative easing and a slashing of the current interest rate, which was kept on hold. What do you make of both of those moves?
Well, I'm not sure about a slashing of the current interest rate, maybe a modest adjustment
A
downwards.
very, very modest reduction.
Now, what would you do if you're in Draghi's position and you know, people, all the eyes are on you? Are you going to put a fairly benign face forward, or are you going to be really tough and say, well, we're not going to give any more help, whatever happens to the real economy, we don't really care? Of course he's going to say what he said yesterday. You know, he's going to say that if the economy needs more help, we'll give it.
Let's talk Federal Reserve Bank of England, because I touched on it there too, about who will be the first, who blinks first to start raising rates. And a lot of expectation now that the UK economy is actually stronger than that of the US, and it could be the UK that goes first, when up until now all eyes have been on the central bank in America about whether they will be the first to hike rates.
I think that is a very interesting question. You know, I think a lot of people feel that the Bank of England isn't brave enough and really needs the lead to be given by the Federal Reserve. That's not necessarily the case, but certainly I think in both countries there is a very strong case now for interest rates starting to rise. What we need to do is remind people that we are still at emergency levels of interest rates, when actually growth is at a pretty normal pace, and we have very tight labour markets, and that is pushing up wages.
Well, actually, on that, just referring to the growth of the UK economy at the moment, obviously yesterday we had these very strong retail numbers. Also yesterday we had some pretty encouraging housing data from the States. We've been so consumed recently with the slowdown in China, hasn't there, that we almost sometimes can forget about growth elsewhere in the world. Do you get a sense from what you've seen on markets as well that everything's sort of settling down a little bit this week on the back of some of this more positive data from the West?
Yeah, I think that some of the tension that came through in markets in September over the slowdown in emerging economies, which perhaps have become a little bit more extreme, that's beginning to dissipate. Markets are looking more confident. And I think the confidence is coming from the fact there is still good momentum within domestic demand in Western economies. And I don't think, for instance, the slowdown in China is going to have a major negative effect on, say, the UK or the US, because China is not a big export market for us. We export more to Ireland in the UK than we do to China, for instance.
OK, Richard, great to hear your thoughts. You're going to stick around and come back and talk through some papers with us a little bit later, I think. Many thanks for that.
Nice to see you, Richard. Thank you. But still to come here on Business Live, why a billionaire couple in America gave $20 million to a university, but
then took it back when the college didn't rename itself after them. Oh yes, we'll explain. You're with Business Live from BBC News.
We live in a world of mobile technology, but it is not the device that is mobile, it is you.
Real Madrid have about 450 million fans. We're trying to give them all the feeling of being at the stadium. The Microsoft Cloud gives us the scalability to communicate exactly the content that people want to see. Will help people connect to their passion of living Real Madrid.
Of the Macau Grand Prix just got stronger. This year, in Asia's most legendary race, witness the birth of the first ever FIA GT World Cup. This is the Sun City Group 60-second Macau Grand Prix.
What creates the perfect cultural storm, where brilliant minds collide in one place and in one magical moment in time?
This is a room that produced some of the great paintings of the 20th century.
Dr. James Fox explores Vienna, Paris and New York, hosting some of the brightest artistic talent that shaped our world today.
There were a handful of moments when one particular city exploded into life.
Bright lights, brilliant minds on BBC World News.
This is the most extreme journey that African migrants will ever undertake. There is no going back.
Libya's problem is it has only 8 of these boats to patrol 1,200 miles of coastline. That's not nearly enough, says the Navy.
Thousands more have arrived on these beaches in the last few weeks, and they're now part of an elaborate smuggling system.
Any government that says yes to her coming will be faced with questions from many other people demanding why not them.
What happened here, the image of Aylan Kurdi's body washing up at this spot, has profoundly shocked this country.
Everyone who embarks on this journey knows it carries great risk, and yet many still believe it's a risk worth taking.
In the eyes of Berlin, other EU member states simply aren't doing enough to help.
As winter approaches, Europeans are agonising what to do with this flood of refugees and other migrants heading their way.
As the crisis continues, so will our coverage.
Hello, you're watching Business Live. Our top story today, the tech giant Amazon has reported a surprise profit, and Google's Alphabet company, as it's now known, has seen its profits soar by 50%. It's been a real mixed bag for tech firms. Microsoft not faring quite so well, but nonetheless still surprising some investors.
Yeah, absolutely right. Now, it can't have escaped your attention, but it's Friday, which means that we'll take a step back behind the headlines and look at what we know this week that we didn't know last week. And the man with the insight is our very own economics correspondent, Andrew Walker. And in the UK, the week was really dominated by the pomp and ceremony of the Chinese Premier state visit to the UK.
Yes, well, his visit included a dinner at Buckingham Palace. All of that, the pomp and ceremony, the Queen signed, with the Queen, I should say, and they also signed billions of dollars worth of investment deals. But the big question, what does China get out of all of this? We'll discuss that with Andrew.
Yeah, we'll also be taking the temperature of the Europe's economic recovery, specifically in the Eurozone, surprisingly. It's good news on Spanish unemployment this week, falling to its lowest level since 2011. So how is the rest of the EU faring?
And we'll also look ahead to crucial elections that take place in Argentina this weekend, where the economy is still in serious trouble.
Yeah, absolutely right. Well, joining us here in the studio, you saw the build-up, Andrew Walker. Shouldn't laugh. You are the man with the inside knowledge. That's why you're here, or with the inside track. OK, so let's begin with the visit, the state visit of Xi Jinping. We really rolled out the red carpet, didn't we? We keep hearing this figure, 30 billion or plus potentially worth of investment. Now he's on his way to Manchester to help generate the northern powerhouse. So much to cover.
Yeah, well, clearly there's an awful lot that the UK, or certainly the British government, feels it has to gain from this. But what's China going to get out of it? Well, I mean, clearly by bringing significant amounts of investment in, China is hoping to make some money from it, from essentially putting to good use the enormous foreign currency reserves it's built out over the years of intervening to prevent its own currency from rising too much. But I think that's not the really big picture for Xi Jinping. It's really much more strategic, much more long-term. It's more of a kind of bestowing of a kind of credibility, respectability on China. And I think a really good example of this is the nuclear investment. China is, we know it's proposing to get in along with a French company to do Hinkley Point. But the longer term plan is for Bradwell in Essex, where China would be the majority investor, and it would presumably be Chinese technology that was incorporated in it. Therefore, if they can get this up and running through British safety regulations and all that, it's an enormous stamp of approval that really gives China a big bridgehead into the global nuclear market.
But Andrew, of course, you can't mention this visit without touching on some of the huge controversies that have come with it. Of course, we had the announcement this week of further shutdowns in the UK steel industry at a time when there's this alleged dumping of Chinese steel on the UK market, something, of course, that China refutes. But it's been controversial as well.
This question of steel, China undoubtedly does have a role in this, whether or not you accept the specific allegation of dumping. Steel is an awful lot cheaper than it was a couple of years ago, and China is relevant on both the supply and demand side of that. Supply, because dumped or not, Chinese steel production has increased dramatically over the last decade or more, and on the demand side, well, it's this China's slowdown, its declining appetite to use steel itself. That's the other part of what's been driving the steel price down, and has led to these great difficulties for British steelmakers.
All of this begs the question, though, Andrew. I spent Monday on a quay side in Essex looking at containers coming in from around the world, particularly China. Tuesday at a factory that was saved by Chinese money. All of that begging the question, what does China get out of this?
It's a showcase, really, I think. It's a kind of bridgehead, a kind of statement that we've got this kind of seal of approval from the British government. Ultimately, as I was saying, if they do go ahead with this new Chinese-designed nuclear power plant in Essex, that would be a huge bridgehead into the global market. It's more that kind of long-term strategic thinking. Sure, they want to make money in the short term out of these investments, but it's really for the long term. There are other markets, even bigger than the UK, that I think China has in mind here.
Briefly, I just wanted to talk about the Eurozone. I mean, time's against us, but clearly we've had different bits of economic data this week from the Eurozone. Mario Draghi's comments yesterday, the President of the European Central Bank, things starting to look up across the board with certain exceptions.
I think what was particularly bothering Mario Draghi was inflation and the outlook for inflation. We had a negative figure again in the most recent data, and clearly he does seem to be preparing the way to give a bit more stimulus to try and get inflation back up. This morning we have had some business survey data from France and Germany, which were slightly better than previous figures and slightly better than expectations. So that's reasonably encouraging. And we had these really, again, quite strikingly, in relative terms, good Spanish unemployment figures, best they've had since for 4 years or more. Bear in mind, though, it is still a very high level, above 20%. So there is still life in the Eurozone economy, but it remains the case, recovery, yes, but it's never been a really convincing, a really robust one.
OK, Andrew, many thanks. Andrew Walker there, our economic correspondent, giving us the inside track.
Just a reminder, coming up on Monday's programme, we're going to speak to John Stevens, the Global Chief Executive of RSM International, the 7th biggest accountancy firm in the world. She is a huge advocate of diversity in the workplace, so we'll be talking to her about the implications on business.
Sounds great. But don't forget that there are lots of ways to keep up to date with everything that's happening with BBC News, even when you're on the move. And we'd love to hear from you as well. Here's just a quick reminder of how to get in touch.
The Business Live webpage is where you can stay ahead with all the day's breaking business news. We'll keep you up to date with all the latest details, with insight and analysis from the BBC's team of editors right around the world. And we want to hear from you too. Get involved on the BBC Business Live webpage at bbc.com/business. Or on Twitter, we're at BBC Business, and you can find us on Facebook at BBC Business News. Business Live on TV and online whenever you need to know.
Hi there, you're watching Business Live with Ben Thompson and myself. Now, at the beginning of the programme, we asked you to tweet in telling us what's the most generous thing that your boss has ever done. This comes in the wake of the CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, telling his staff that he's going to give them a portion of his shares. And Ben, we've had a few replies in, haven't we?
Yeah, a really nice one here. My boss has given me something more valuable than money, says Kassem. Inspiration and a belief in doing the impossible. We like that note, nice note on a Friday. But very also nice. Many of you getting in touch with us about TalkTalk as well, that story we've covered earlier. One question, why hasn't all of your customer information been encrypted? That is still the big question for the boss of TalkTalk.
Yeah, and one also about the state of the UK economy. It's still strong, LOL, not in the real world. It isn't. Go on, put up interest rates, then watch the UK economy collapse fast.
LOL, there's a way to end the week. Richard is back with us. Richard Jeffries, Chief Investment Officer at Cazenove Capital. Richard, welcome back.
Thanks. Nice.
Let's talk paper stories, because this one caught our eye this morning. Billionaire couple withdraws $20 million donation because the college can't rename itself for them. So it's like, here's the money. Here, do with it what you want, but you've got to name the college after us. Oh, you can't, we want the money back.
Yeah, it has a slightly difficult feel to this story, isn't it? Actually, it's not uncommon for major donors to buy the name, as it were, and have their own name placed over the portals. And it happens in the UK, it happens in the US. It couldn't happen in this situation because of the foundation of the college, and it was written in stone, as it were. But you do feel if you really want to give money, shouldn't you give it, without the naming? Shouldn't it be the gift that counts?
Without terms and conditions attached.
Did they get the memo on philanthropy? Just want to quickly also bring you to this story coming to us from Business Inside UK. Deutsche Bank warning that they see the burst in the bubble in sight for London's property prices.
Yeah, interesting story. Funnily enough, I think the bit of the story that I think is more important that they didn't talk about is that the London property market is very much dependent on what happens in emerging markets. Emerging markets slowing, London property markets slowing. That's the explanation.
Couldn't have put it better myself. Richard Jeffrey, many thanks. Always good to get your views. Wonderful.
Thank you for your company today. Much more business news throughout the day, but wherever you are, have a great weekend. We'll see you bright and early on Monday. See you then.
See you then. Bye. Have a great weekend.